Okay. Hello, and thank you for joining this breakout session at the 2020 Ignatian Family Teach-In for Justice entitled Discerning on Fossil Fuel Endowment Investments at Jesuit Institutions. My name is Nick Napolitano, and I'm the Provincial Assistant for Social Ministries for the USA East Jesuit Province, and I'm the current chair of the Jesuit Committee on Investment Responsibility, comprised of representatives from the Jesuit provinces in Canada and the US engaged in corporate shareholder advocacy and promoting socially responsible investing. I will be co-facilitating this session with my peer, colleague, and friend, John Seeley, Provincial Assistant for Social and International Ministries for the USA Midwest Jesuit Province. Thank you, John. In past years, we have held workshops at the Teach-In to encourage students, faculty, staff, and Jesuits to consider engaging in socially responsible investing work. During the question and answer period these last few years, students have rightfully asked questions on ethical and moral issues of fossil fuel investments in our institutional endowments. Their concerns have been squarely in line with the Catholic Church, stated more clearly each year by Pope Francis since the release of Laudato Si in 2015. In his 2020 TED Talk, Pope Francis recommended divesting from stock in, quote, companies that do not meet the criteria of integral ecology and rewarding those that are making concrete efforts in this transition phase to put at the center of their activities criteria such as sustainability, social justice, and the promotion of the common good. Part of our own evolution in thinking about fossil fuel endowment investments has been driven by the growing climate crisis and the urgent need to eliminate greenhouse gas emissions in a relatively short time frame. Because of this limited time horizon, we worry that we cannot achieve the necessary emission reductions solely through corporate shareholder advocacy. At the same time, we recognize the need to have companies at the table changing the way they do business if we are to limit post-industrial era global temperature increases to 1.5 degrees Celsius. This is a tension that cries out for Ignatian discernment. Today, we will talk with our panelists about how fossil fuel divestment is an ethical and effective path for our institutions to pursue. Joe Gaffney, our first panelist, graduated from Seattle University in 1967 with a degree in accounting, which launched a 47-year legal career in tax and estate planning. Joe is a member of the Seattle University Board of Trustees and a member of the Socially Responsible Investment Committee. He was an important leader in navigating the board's decision to divest from fossil fuels. Gabby Baker is a senior at Creighton University, studying environmental science, philosophy, and Spanish on the pre-law track. I didn't know you could have that many majors, Gabby. She has served in multiple positions with the university's student governments, currently as chairperson of sustainability. Gabby is a leader and advocate on issues of migration and environmental justice, actively involved in sustainability research. Mike Berry is the Chief Investment Officer at Georgetown University, where he has overseen the university's investment portfolios and coordinated the university's Committee on Investments and Social Responsibility since 2011. Michael sits on the investment committee at Georgetown Prep, among many others, and he is a graduate of Fairfield University. John, we'll turn to you for the first question for our panelists.
Thanks, Nick, and thank you, panelists. First question for Joe. Joe, we know that you're a deeply formed lay colleague. Can you share a little bit about how the university's Catholic and Jesuit mission informed the decision of Seattle University's trustees to move toward disinvestment of fossil fuels?
Yes, thanks, John. You know, the mission statement for Seattle U includes a phrase to educate leaders for a just and humane world. And that's taken very seriously by the Board of Trustees. We refer to that in every meeting. It's a very important thing. And with respect to the fossil fuel divestment, it was a very important thing in the whole process. The process that we went through to do this started with student action in 2013 and culminated in the board adopting a resolution in September of 2018 after a process which I can go into. But the board adopted a resolution that we would be totally divested of companies holding fossil fuels, and there's technical definitions from the investment committee that are very rigorous. And we would be totally divested by June 30th, by December. Well, we'd be totally divested by June 30th, 2023, and 50% divested by December of 2020. And we've already accomplished that 50% divestment as of the end of 2019. Our investment advisor has been incredibly supportive of this and helpful in this process. Our endowment, which is only about 220 million, is all managed by managers. We didn't have any direct investment, so we couldn't directly divest. And it's hard to carry out this idea of divesting when you have managers, because most of them don't have sleeves that are all. So we had to work hard on this, and we had, I don't know if you want to go into the process now, but the way this was done was with the student action, which was very significant on this. The president of the university delegated to the investment committee to look into this and see what we could do. I'm on the investment committee as well. And what ended up happening was that it resulted in a 13-person committee comprised of 3 trustees or investment committee members, 2 students, an alumni representative, a faculty representative, and a staff representative. We spent like 3 years working this through, presented recommendations to the investment committee, which we were a subcommittee of. The investment committee felt uncomfortable with making a judgment. They considered themselves to be investment people with a fiduciary responsibility to manage investments. The social responsible committee felt that we were more, that the ethical considerations included those considerations at the investment committee level, but the investment committee, by majority vote, wanted the trustees to make the ethical decisions. So we went to the trustees with these recommendations that resulted in robust discussion and actually very unanimous decision to divest, which we were very happy about, and we felt that it was a result of a lot of discernment and hard work and education. So we really educated, with the help of our investment advisor, how to do this in a practical way to fight climate change, not just rhetorically, but through action.
Thank you, Joe.
Thanks, Joe. Gabby, we'd like to turn to you next. We're interested in understanding what are some of the indicators for you that traditional shareholder advocacy is ineffective with the fossil fuel industry, and that divestment is a more viable option for change?
It's a great question, because that's oftentimes one of the first questions we get asked when we're talking about divestment, both as students, but then even as institutions. And one way in which, like, it does sound great. Shareholder advocacy seems like it'd be beneficial for both the investors and the company itself, but most shareholder resolutions are not taken into account and aren't binding contracts for the corporations themselves. And sometimes those interests of the company don't even follow the interests of the individuals behind it. One basic problem with shareholder advocacy within fossil fuel companies are that they have to change their bottom line. One example that's usually used for why we should use shareholder advocacy, it was within Nike's working conditions in 2001. Although shareholders were able to see significant change within Nike's conditions of workers, they didn't alter their core business model like we are asking these fossil fuel companies to do. the core business model of these fossil fuel companies is to burn their reserves, which they've already spent money on, and shareholder advocacy just doesn't convince them otherwise. Our asks towards fossil fuel companies are to not just improve conditions, not to improve processes, not to change methods, but to totally change their business models. And oftentimes they are not willing to even change that. We've seen for decades now that even with the understanding and the science behind it, we couldn't still convince fossil fuel companies because of the moral understanding. And now with an economic change, we need to take our money out of the companies so that we can actually enact the change that we're hoping to see.
Thanks, Gabby. John, do you have any follow-ups on that?
Gabby, in terms of the core business model, you mentioned, the reserves and the exploration for new reserves to perpetuate the business model. Did you look at all at issues such as lobbying for business as usual, or even, money spent on campaigns in regard to perpetuating a public relations image?
In several of my environmental science classes that I've taken here at Creighton have actually focused on that sense of how are fossil fuel companies using their money to influence the image that the company has itself by taking out our finances from those organizations. We're saying like our own morals are not being upheld within the organizations themselves and within the industry itself. We did look into several other organizations and institutions as how they worked on their divestment models themselves and why they decided to do it. Because when we spoke with our financial advisors here at Creighton, they thought that it would be more financially responsible to advocate for shareholder advocacy. But due to the nature of us seeing consistent lobbying towards certain political figures that wanted to continue to increase environmental degradation and increase inequality within our world, we decided that that was against the mission of Creighton and Jesuit universities themselves. Did I answer that question well enough?
Thanks, Gabby. Michael, could we ask how your outlook and understanding of divestment evolved over time and at Georgetown? And did, yourself as a financial professional, did the return inform the decision? That is to say, the underperformance of fossil fuels looking back 10, 20, 30 years, or the concerns regarding fossil fuels as potential trapped assets and the downside risk in terms of fossil fuels from a fiduciary standpoint?
So I think to try to describe Georgetown's process through this situation, this decision, is multifaceted. We had, on the one hand, the financial work, the investment-related work that our office was conducting in conjunction with our investment committee and our finance committee. We had a very active student group that started around 2013, and then board-level discussions around socially responsible investing more broadly. And so I think kind of these issues all were running parallel tracks for us. And so we had our first student movement really spring up in 2013, and we'd already had for a number of decades in place a committee called a Committee on Investments and Social Responsibility. And that committee's purpose primarily for a number of years had been to vote on proxies. And we repurposed that committee just a little bit by luck in 2012 to be the primary focal point for inquiry from the community on any topic relating to social responsible investing. And what that did is it put in place an infrastructure for the students to navigate, for the board to understand how issues would be vetted, to have the president's office and other offices direct inquiry, and so that there was a reasonable infrastructure in place to tackle these questions. So we had this one inquiry come in, and that really kicked off the internal SRI side of the debate for us. And where that initial decision ultimately landed was on a divestment from our direct holdings of coal companies. We had a couple, but not very many, mostly in some separate accounts. John, as you mentioned, we have most of our, or Joe, I'm sorry, most of our accounts are with managers where we don't really control the stock picking. So, you know, it was a nice first step. But the real big output from that decision was that the board kicked off a period of introspection, and the chairman of our board at the time, Paul Tagliabue, led a board working group on our social responsible investing policy. And that was a working group comprised of board members and some staff. And we spent about a year really thinking deeply about our SRI policy overall and establishing a framework that could handle a wide range of issues. So we got to a place where we've established that policy. It's on our website if you're curious to check it out. And with that as a backdrop, that kind of allowed us to move into a position where we were ready to think about divestment a little bit more broadly. And kind of back on the other parallel track of running on the investment side of things, really starting in 2013, just speaking from an investment perspective, we noticed the inflection upwards of US oil production quite sharply. We've been running around 5 to 6 million barrels a day. And with the fracking shale revolution, that started to inflect quite strongly in 2012, 2013. And that got our eyes up. And we decided, seeing that increase in supply, we also noticed that there was a very large increase in capital seeking private investments in oil and gas. And we decided at that point, strictly from an investment opportunity, to ease back a bit. And we actually sold our private oil and gas investments, the vast majority of them, in the middle of 2014. We didn't divest in a formal divestment sense. We just really reduced the exposure from a purely financial perspective. But that really got our attention more broadly on the overall investment outlook for the energy industry, and thinking about it from a number of lenses, not only from just the pure bottom-up fundamental approach of the companies, but also thinking about what do the next 10, 15, 20 years look like, and how is climate change going to impact the outlook for the industry. And the main conclusion that we started to arrive at, speaking strictly on the investment side, was that the range of outcomes for the sector was very wide. And so wide as to be, on a risk-reward basis, unattractive compared to everything else that we can invest in the world. There were too many macro variables on both supply and demand side for oil and natural gas and coal. And we were not in a position, we don't think we're in a position to really get our head around the scope of those variables. And they have very large impacts on the companies that are in this sector. So we got to a place by 2018, 2019, where we'd started to really appreciate that just from a financial investment perspective, that the risk reward opportunity compared to other sectors in the economy for investing in fossil fuel producer companies was not as good compared to elsewhere. So we started to think about, okay, well, we're not really financially interested in this sector anymore. And then we started to weave back in the climate change issue and looking at sustainability overall, and then really started over the past 5 to 7 years really embracing an understanding of climate change and feeling that it was our duty to be involved in solutions rather than being a beneficiary of perhaps some of the problems. So we decided at that point to start really looking hard at renewable power, sustainable investing, and then ultimately culminating in the process in 2019 where we decided formally to go forward. This was again led by a student group proposal in 2019, but that committee that I mentioned, Committee on Investments and Social Responsibility, decided to hear that proposal again and then finally go forward with a recommendation for full divestment, which we arrived at, it feels like a lifetime ago, but in February of 2020. And so that's where we've landed in that long journey, is we've now adopted a policy at the board level where we are moving toward full divestment over 5 years from all public companies and over 10 years for all private companies. We are very close to getting there already. On the public side, it's less than 2.5–3% of the total endowment overall. And on the private side, we have one firm with 2 partnerships remaining that are tied to oil and gas production. And those just take a few years to run off. So, and that work kind of really began back in, again, 2014 on the private side, but then throughout 2016 all the way to 2019, we started decreasing our exposure to the public companies as well. And here we are today, where it's in aggregate less than 3%. So I'll pause there, but that's a little bit of a ramble about how we got to our decision in February.
Great. Thanks, Michael. And thanks for making that important point of the linkage between disinvestment and reinvestment into renewables to reward those enterprises that are moving forward in a green way and reducing our exposure to fossil fuel companies, especially coal, oil, and gas. So thank you, Michael. Nick?
Yeah, thanks, John. Joe, we realize that one aspect of fossil fuel divestment as an ethical stance, for it to be a prophetic action, it needs to inspire others connected to that decision, other stakeholders, to eliminate their own carbon emissions. I'm wondering if you could say a bit about how Seattle University announced their divestment decision to the external public, and what kind of feedback, both positive and negative, the university has gotten from stakeholders, people like alumni or current members of the community, students, staff, faculty.
Thank you, Nick. We had a really well-defined communication plan at the time. We went to the public media. We had an announcement on campus. We had faculty meetings. We put out a program for the faculty's self-directed retirement plan where they could get green sleeves, social responsible investing options. The alumni was through our newsletters and online. So we really did have a plan from the university's communication office that was, I thought, carried out very well. We were, surprisingly, we got very little negative feedback. We had one donor who was a significant, not one of our top donors, but a significant donor who was very upset about it. But in general, people applauded it. You know, Seattle U also has a priority of being a sustainable partner. You know, all kinds of green efforts have gone on there. We have 4 LEED gold buildings. We have recycling, and we don't sell any plastic bottles on campus. There's a whole lot of environmentally sensitive initiatives that are carried out. Seattle U has gotten a lot of awards for this, so we continually emphasize our sustainability cred on this everywhere. We were awarded in one of the environmental magazines, one of the coolest universities in the country to go to environmentally. So we've done a lot on that.
Joe, what do you think the impact has been in terms of other Jesuit higher education institutions? Seattle is an early adopter of this decision, this stance, and this strategy, investment-wise, endowment-wise. What do you think? I mean, I'm not sure how much boards of trustees talk together, but certainly you would hear from the president of the university talking to other presidents. How has Seattle's decision influenced others in Jesuit higher education, do you think?
Well, I know that there's been lots of discussion. I personally was not involved with that. You know, I was chair of the committee, the task force that put all this together and got it all done. But Andrew O'Boyle, who was an investment person in the vice president of the finance office, supported this a lot. And I know he talked and reported to me about discussions he had had with other universities, including Georgetown, Creighton, Santa Clara, and I think others. And of course, the students were very active in talking to the Students for Sustainable Action around the country. So I know there was a lot of discussion about that, but I was not personally involved. I did do a lot of discussing with other trustees in Seattle about it, why it was important. But, you know, the ethical standard and the mission of educating leaders for a just and humane world is taken very seriously. And it's right in the forefront of what Seattle does. So this was right in the wheelhouse of people's rhetoric. Now we had to take action. When it was done, and continues to be, people are very proud of it.
Thanks, Joe.
Thank you, Joe. Gabby, as a student leader, you're a senior now, so you've seen this over a duration of time at Creighton. Can you share a little bit about what steps students took to organize themselves and educate themselves and engage the university? And what have you learned from this work as you move on, from undergrad to law school and pass that leadership on to younger students?
Thanks, John. Well, one thing that we started to notice was right when I got to campus as a freshman, there had been talks about divestment because other institutions had started to have those conversations, and those students that were environmentally conscious were actually talking with their friends from back home that were going to other institutions to see what was actually happening on their campuses. But what we started to see in 2017 as a small committee of our sustainability group, we started to talk about legislation for our university itself to see how we could have them change their investment policies and also divest from fossil fuels and reinvest in renewable energy sources. That first took a lot of education and understanding what divestment was itself, because as a freshman, I had no idea. And now I've gained a lot more of an understanding as to the economic side of it, but then also our financial and moral responsibility for doing so. We tried to pass a referendum 3 times. So it didn't pass the first time through in 2018. And then in 2019, we repassed a referendum, which was then brought back. And we had our final referendum that was sent and then submitted to all of the students to have a vote on. And over 86% of students voted yes, which was actually one of our years of the most highest voter turnout for students, which was because our students were actually advocating and wanting to learn and be socially responsible for the actions of the university, but then also themselves. When our university came back and said that they wouldn't be divesting, we as students came together and even started a group me, which had over 500 to 600 people. And from those people, I started to see the motivation these students had, which I hadn't really seen before, because we always hear about talks of movements, but then seeing our campus actually come together and try and promote the Jesuit values that our school says and exemplifies made it so much more powerful and motivating. So our leaders came together and we started creating different peaceful protests within our campus that was to show our university that this many students care. They're going to show up and they're going to call you to say and to act in the way in which our university is supposed to. We've spoken with other institutions that have also divested, from their student organizations to also their leaders in their institutions, but have also reached out to media sources so that we could promote a larger conversation, not solely within Creighton, but also in our community in Omaha, because I know that we could be a lot more environmentally conscious here in Omaha. And as one of those leaders within the community, Creighton has a social responsibility for both itself as an institution and the community in which we're a part of. We've had several different social media campaigns, recruitment efforts through our campus, and different climate conversations that have come about because of our talks about divestment and our environmental responsibility. And I think that it's given all of us a sense of hope for what the university can do, but what we each can do in our futures. I think that's something I definitely learned, was climate change always seems like this overwhelming idea and concept for students when they're learning about it, but having physical action steps that we can take within both our financial responsibility, however we use our money, to even the ways in which we act and advocate, shows how much we can actually do and how movements can come about and influence campuses and communities.
Thanks, Gabby. I really appreciate that. And you mentioned, and Joe and Michael also mentioned, the importance of student movement on this, student awareness. Your time horizon on this earth is probably the longest for anyone on this panel, your time frame. And, the Jesuits worldwide have announced these new universal apostolic preferences, one of which is journeying with youth, youth being defined as those 18 to 24 by the United Nations. So, so much leadership and inspiration has come from students on this particular issue. So thank you, Gabby, and Joe and Michael for mentioning that on your campuses.
Thanks, Gabby. Thanks, John. Mike, you really started to touch on this in your last response. I want to dig a little bit deeper. In implementing and operationalizing the decision to divest from fossil fuels, you've talked about the reality that fund managers are responsible for doing this work, and that policy from the university kind of guides that. But can you talk a little bit about how you've worked with managers to unravel those investments, and also to take a proactive stance in finding investments with strong environmental, social, and governance factors in place, and what you think the impact on that has, both for the university's endowment, but in the university's approach to investing in companies around the world?
Sure. And I want to say just one quick word about the students before I get into that. I don't want to oversell our work with the students. The students have done a tremendous amount of work at Georgetown. Their opinion might be that we are probably resistant at sometimes, but I think overall our perspective on working with the students and working with the administration and board members and all of our constituents has been one of engagement. And so kind of one point of advice would be, if you approach these topics with a perspective of engagement, continued engagement with many, many levels of the university, I think that really in the end benefited us quite a lot, is that we were constantly engaging. And if there's not a formal means to have engagement, that might be the first ask. Let's establish a committee on investment responsibility to explore these issues. And once you get that infrastructure in place, then you can have good debate and a focus point for energy. Sorry for that quick sidebar, but it really did help us throughout the last several years. So on to implementation, we kind of have three main types of investments. We have passive index funds, we have commingled funds, which are run by investment firms, investment managers we call them, and then private equity funds. On the first case with passive funds, what we've just implemented this summer is through one of our index fund providers, State Street Global, not an advertisement for them, but they've done a great job, is an S&P 500 index fund, ex fossil fuels. And it's been provided to us at a cost of 2 basis points. So we have a very attractive low cost vehicle that gives us the exposure to the US market, excluding the fossil fuel producers, at virtually no cost, 2 basis points. And so, on the passive side, we've moved to implement that. That's already in place. On the manager side, I think it becomes challenging when endowment portfolios have a number of generalist managers that tend to be in all sectors at all times. And where we've gone over the last several years, and it's not been driven by divestment, but it's more just our internal strategy, is we tend to navigate to sector specialists. On the one hand, for one segment. And then we also have a segment where we have more concentrated funds. Investment firms that typically hold between 15 to 20 stocks, sometimes as few as 10 to 12 stocks. On the former side with sector specialists, we've just now avoided resource sector. We're now, we no longer have resource dominant sector specialists, and we have tech, consumer, industrials, healthcare, financials. We've got other sectors where we have specialist firms. And then on the concentrated side, all of our managers there just don't pursue investments in this sector. So it's really started from how we approach investing and how we approach partnering with firms. I think it'd be harder if we had just a handful of very generalist firms that felt obligated to be in all sectors because they're trying to beat a benchmark over 1 quarter or 1 year, even 2 to 3 years. But we take a little bit more of an absolute return focus in the long term, and less worried about too closely matching or beating the benchmark over the short term, which means that you can alleviate yourself from having to worry about having exposure to that sector in the economy. And then on the private side, as I mentioned earlier, we stopped investing and sold our private investments in 2014. We made one subsequent investment in 2016 after oil had cratered, and that single manager relationship is unrolling over the next several years. So the implementation part, if you have a portfolio with generalist funds, it is a little bit difficult. It's easier when you've got a bit more of a narrow or nichier focus on manager implementation. But then more broadly also about ESG, we've opened up those conversations with our managers. We've also gravitated over the last several years to managers that weave ESG into their daily practices, where it's not a sidecar product that they're trying to market just for convenient purposes of addressing a market opportunity, but rather it's part of their the way that they go about their affairs, that they view it as both a opportunity for value creation of the companies that they invest in, but also as a risk mitigant, that companies that will light up on ESG metrics negatively oftentimes present financial risks. So what we like to think is that the majority of our managers these days are weaving ESG naturally into their investment diligence process. It's not something done by a different department that's a check the box process over here, where you're kind of solving for optics. It's more of a weaving in of the actual investment underwriting process.
I appreciate you, Mike, raising that point before you got into the meat of this question, which is that institutions need to have an access point for engagement and dialogue. And that is something that we don't see across many of our Jesuit institutions, including higher ed. And it's an incredibly important and valuable intersection for mission as well as success of the endowment for the university. John, anything else to close for us before we wrap up? I realize we're getting close to, if not over time.
No, I'm really grateful to the panel and also the ways that you were able to speak to, you know, our mission informing this decision. I mean, we could have another panel on how, you know, Laudato Si has spoken to this, Pope Francis, you know, the Synod on the Amazon, you know, the recent document, which has just been translated into English, Journeying to Care for Our Common Home on the 5th anniversary of Laudato Si. But each one seems to be more direct, you know, in terms of having this conversation and this engagement within our institutions. As Michael, you pointed out so well, that's one of our Ignatian charisms, is to reconcile groups that sometimes fall into different encampments. So finding that space where there can be that conversation, presuming the best in one another.
Yeah, I want to echo John's gratitude for folks in this panel and hope that this is the beginning of an ongoing conversation that we can support across institutions as they wrestle with this important question. Thanks for joining us in this breakout session. I hope you enjoy the rest of the teach-in. Peace.